I'd say the purpose of a video or a film is to try to keep your audience engaged, ideally emotionally engaged, and feeling a series of emotions and reactions to a story. I'd say that a good chunk of film theory works specifically towards that end of creating visuals and then cutting those visuals together to create a story that impacts emotionally. However, like my old boss used to say, a confused customer never buys. A confused audience member is not engaged. So a huge part of the battle of being a filmmaker or a film editor is making sure that your audience isn't confused, that they understand what is going on in the story, that they understand the subtext between the different characters. Simple things to the point of they understand who is holding what object, and that they understand where the characters are at in relationship to each other, and that we know where a threat is coming from. Your audience needs to understand the story. They need to understand the relationship dynamics. They need to understand the physical space the actors are in. They need to understand. So we're going to touch on a bunch of film rules really quickly that kind of exist, I would argue, a lot of times just to make sure the storytelling is clear. These are essentially things that filmmakers have found over the years that can be a source of confusion unless handled appropriately. One interesting concept to keep in mind: the camera is the point of view of the audience 100% of the time, but it can also take on certain pronouns or points of view within the story. There are different ways to use a camera to essentially expand on or limit the amount that an audience knows about what's going on. For example, let's say that we're doing a film about two buddies out on a camping trip. They're talking around a campfire, laughing and joking as the sun goes down. They decide to go to bed, they stomp out the campfire, they get in their tents and fall asleep. There are tons of different ways that a cinematographer could approach this scene in order to get different points of view and different understandings of what's happening. One would be slightly isolated. You could do a version of this scene where we're really close up on one character, but constantly farther away from the other character, where our primary character is in essentially every shot, and our secondary character is never in a shot on their own. This would be more of a first-person perspective. Now, that sounds a little misleading because I'm not saying that we're going to do a POV from his viewpoint. We're not actually seeing it through his eyes, but we're experiencing his emotions with him. We need to see him to be able to do that. But the camera is focused on him and his experience. A different one would be slightly more objective, to treat the characters equally, to give them each their own separate screen time, to equally distribute them in the frame. If we see each one in terms of height and scale and screen time as equal to the other, this would imply more friendship. You could do another one that would essentially be the opposite of that, where we always show one character from slightly lower angles and another character from slightly higher angles, that one seems to be towering over the other a bit. And this would create a bit of a power dynamic and a bit of discomfort. We would feel that one was in the hands of the other. Sometimes the inclusion of a single shot can change the way that a scene ends. So the last action of the night, they're stomping out the fire. If we focused on the character's face as we heard them stomping out the fire, that would imply one thing. But if we saw them stomp out the fire and then walk away to their tent with the embers still hot, that could imply other things. A shot of the embers with a spark right before the scene ends could be really good foreshadowing to a forest fire later on in the movie. The director's line, or the 180-degree rule, has to do with trying to help the audience understand the geography between actors. In real life, we have a specific vantage point, and everything is relatively to our right or our left because of that. So when we are witnessing a conversation between two other people, they will be looking to each other. The person on the right will be looking at the person on the left, looking towards our left side, and vice versa. That's the way that we witness the world. The thing with the camera is that we're not locked into one specific vantage point. We can move the camera anywhere we want, which is cool, but also can get really confusing. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have two characters who are supposed to be talking to each other, both looking to the left side of the screen. But that's what happens if you shoot from opposite sides of the conversation. If you shoot one person from one side and the other person from the opposite side, they'll both be looking to the left, which is kind of counterintuitive, but is absolutely how it works. So the director's line is a rule to help you remember to keep the established geography between characters. It's called the 180-degree rule because once you establish a specific vantage point, you have about 180 degrees of movement before you start to break the geography. This gets more complicated the more characters that you have to try to keep everything consistent, knowing where eye lines are going. But that's another term that's important to consider, is an actor's eye line. Where are they looking? So your first shot establishes the geography of a scene, and you usually want to avoid crossing that 180-degree line and going to the other side of it because you will break the geography and create confusion. Even when you're doing a shot reverse shot of two characters looking directly at each other, you want to do those shots from over the shoulder so that the characters are ever so slightly looking either to the left or to the right so that we can feel like they're still looking at each other. Now, thanks to the internet, intentional jump cuts are a normal part of film language now. But there still is kind of this gross in-between place. It's not a jump cut because it moved a little bit, but it didn't move enough to feel like a new shot. This gross in-between place usually doesn't feel intentional. I really actually can't think of a time when you would make these little tiny adjustments and it would look intentional and well done. So the general rule of thumb is that your camera needs to move 30 degrees or your focal length needs to change by 20% in order for it to be different enough to feel like a new shot. Screen direction goes along with everything else that we've discussed so far. This is character or subject movement within the frame. Typically, especially in English-speaking countries, moving from left to right feels like forward movement because that's how we read. Moving right to left feels like backwards movement because we don't read backwards. So not only does screen direction have small implications culturally, but the consistency between screen directions is critically important. If your characters are going on a journey and they start moving from left to right, even if that's just walking to the front door from left to right, they need to continue moving from left to right in the next shot. It's kind of like the 180-degree rule, except for it's not just one specific location and one specific geography. Now, bear in mind, there's a lot more directions that a character can move than just left to right or up and down. But that's essentially all that we see. This is a two-dimensional medium, more or less. So even if 90% of the character's movement is just moving from farther away to closer up, they need to go slightly left or slightly right and then continue that in the next frame. These are little things that most people don't notice. In fact, so many people don't notice them that most social media influencers who make videos professionally don't even realize that they're not doing it. I have seen way too many stupid social media posts where both of the characters in the skit are looking to the left in the frame. And we understand it. We've watched enough social media posts to know that it's low effort. They're wearing a different hat and using a slightly different timbre in their voice. We get that it's a different character. But that kind of video making requires the audience to use way more of their imagination. And when we're doing short films or feature films or professional work, our video is supposed to be what it is. Unlike these social media posts, which are implying and suggesting and asking the audience to use their imagination to go with it, most professional work is being the thing so that the person doesn't use their imagination. Instead, they are experiencing the visuals. So our visuals have to be good. Another film rule is that every shot must provide new information. Sometimes that's as simple as we want to see the emotional reaction that a character has to something else that another character says. That is technically new information. But if a shot provides no new information whatsoever, there is no point to having the new shot. There's a few more film rules that get more editing specific. We're going to go further into depth with them when we get to editing theory, but I'm going to briefly touch on them. The first one is film time. A single 5-minute scene could cover the course of a year of a character's life, or a 5-minute scene could cover 5 seconds. The way that it's shot and the way that it's edited can compress or elongate the time that the character is actually experiencing. Animes are really, really good at taking moments, sometimes brief milliseconds, and turning them into 2 or 3 minute monologues, which is kind of a fun anime trope. You have the stereotypical training montage, which usually implies weeks or months have gone by, even though for the audience, we only just watched a montage for like 30 seconds. Those are the obvious examples, but there's a lot more, and we'll get into how to do with them later. But film time is another rule to consider.